These shots were lit using two different lights at full brightness from the same company. One of these lights cost $1,200 and the other cost $350. Doesn't quite look like $850 of difference, does it? But I should know better. The light output might look similar, but the cheaper fixture's going to have some compromises for sure. But well, I think that's precisely the reason the Amaran 200x exists. It's missing out on some luxurious features, but by doing so, it costs about 3.5 times less than the Lightstorm 300x, while at the same time, it's actually slightly outperforming the 300x when it comes to output brightness. So what exactly are these compromises on the 200x? It starts with things like not coming with a carrying case, not having a dedicated remote control for it, the build of the light being primarily plastic. It's also now a single point yoke instead of the standard U-shaped one. It doesn't ship with a solution for battery powering the light, and the light has no support for DMX. Now I did just dish out a whole bunch of disadvantages, but if we think realistically for a moment, everything I just mentioned are not likely to be deal breakers for the 200x unless you're looking to get a light for something like a high-end production film set, and even though it is from Aputure's budget line of fixtures, I think they did a very good job at not compromising on the things that matter most. Specifically the quality and brightness of its output. Across its color temperature range, I was measuring great CRI scores throughout, 95 and up. It's also super bright for a bicolor light with this power draw in this price range, and I did find some pretty interesting results when comparing this against the 300x in terms of output brightness, but I'll be talking about that a little later in this review because now we're on the topic of things this light did not cheap out on, so we have to talk about cytosine support on the 200x. I think it was quite graceful of Aputure to not purposely exclude cytosine compatibility across their new Amaran COB lights, because in my honest opinion, it was easily a feature they could have intentionally left out just to segregate their Amaran line from their high-end Lightstorm line. The difference in retail price alone could justify the removal, but I'm really glad they did not do that. I actually find having cytosine support to be a much bigger deal on these new Amarans than the Lightstorms for a couple of reasons. First of all being, all the controls for the lights are on the lamp head itself. On something like the 300x, your controls are on the power supply box that live lower down on the light stand, so you can always tweak your settings from there. But here on the 200x, if you have the light high up on the light stand, you can't reach the controls or even see the display, which can be a major inconvenience if you're trying to fine-tune the output after your lights are set. It's times like these when Cytos on your phone becomes particularly helpful to control the light remotely. Another huge advantage of using cytosine is how it enables lighting effects. Now, these effects are not able to be triggered directly from the light itself, so you can kind of think of this as a bonus feature gained by using the app. It's also worth noting that bicolor COB style lights like this are a bit of a rare breed, and even more so in the lower price range. So in the current market of lights, I do find the 200x to have quite a unique placement. It's also interesting how it's not exactly a stripped down version of its premium counterpart, the Lightstorm 300x, and I'm saying that because I cannot find any parts on the 200x that are shared with the 300x, which can only mean that they designed this from the ground up. That's also evident in the design of the COB itself. It's not the same one as the 300x. The 300x has a grid of alternating warm and cool diodes behind a blending element. That's the design that enables it to be compatible with optical modifiers. The Amaran 200x does not utilize that design. It's using a much simpler alternating line design. So now you get a row of cool diodes, a row of warm ones, another line of cool, and so on. This design unfortunately means the 200x would not work very well with optical modifiers. Now I don't have the spotlight mount, so I can't speak for that, but I do have a Fresnel 2x. Attaching that to the 200x, you could actually get away with the results. I find the shadow quality to be quite acceptable, really. But if you look at the projection, you will notice a warm patch on the top and bottom region, especially when you have the color temperature set towards the middle of the range. Flooding and spotting the Fresnel is also nowhere near as effective compared to the 300x. The beam angle doesn't really change as much. However, if we compare it head-to-head with the 300x in terms of brightness, I measured their peak brightnesses to be equally bright, and like all bicolor lights, they tend to get brighter as you approach the middle of the CCT range, but I discovered that the two lights hit their peak brightnesses at rather different color temperatures. The 300x peaks around 4500 Kelvin, pretty much smack in the middle of the range, but the 200x peaks around 5800 Kelvin, which is basically in the daylight range. Peak settings aside, however, I did measure the 200x to be slightly brighter than the 300x towards the edges of the range. It's not a huge margin, we're talking about differences less than a third of a stop, which practically speaking might not even make a difference, but that does say something about how incredibly efficient the 200x is. It is putting out at least as much light as the 300x while drawing significantly less power. And these measurements you're looking at, they are measured at their peak power draws. But I do see some other advantages that the 200x may have over the 300x other than brightness and efficiency, and it has to do with its footprint. Now, I did mention that having all the controls built into the fixture itself can present itself as an inconvenience at times, but it can really be both a blessing and a curse. Because that means there's no longer a control box, which means your setup now has less cable connections on top of being a whole lot lighter. The 200x fixture, due to its plastic build, is already about half the weight of the 300x fixture alone. The control box for the 300x is another 2.3 kilos, which is weight that's very likely to be mounted on your light stand as well. Now, in all fairness, the 200x does have a sizable power brick that adds just under about 700 grams to the setup weight, and for simplicity's sake, we're going to completely ignore the weight of the cables, but point is, you're looking at very roughly a 3 kilogram reduction in setup weight on the 200x compared to the 300x. There is, of course, a significant gap in ruggedness of the build when comparing these two lights, so I would really take use case into account here. If the light's going to spend most of its days in an indoor studio without being transported around a lot, the 200x is probably going to survive just fine. But if your use case is more demanding in terms of durability, then I would consider spending extra on that 300x. This light also very recently got a firmware update that allows you to adjust its cooling fan's intensity through the Sidus Link app, because it's not something that you can do on the light itself. Although I personally wouldn't really bother with that, because even at maximum fan drive, let me try and make that happen. And the light is finally getting a little toasty, so this is as high as the fan would go. The app is saying the fan speed's at about 1500 RPM and the internal temperature of the light's at about 65 degrees Celsius. The light is right beside my face, so directly under my microphone, so I wouldn't really say that fan noise is an issue. This is about as extreme as it gets. Your light would ideally almost never be directly under your microphone. Okay, now that I've made my point, let me turn that back down. I do wish, however, that the 200x shipped with longer cables. The one it comes with is not stupidly short by any means, but it would be incredibly helpful if it was, say, as long as the ones that came with the 300x. Very often, it makes the difference between having to go grab a stinger and not having to. That being said, in terms of features and price points, I don't think Aputure could have done a better job at positioning the 200x. Sure, it's got some compromises when compared against the high-end, but most of the quality of life features they've excluded from this light, such as DMX, battery plates, and superior materials, might not even be useful for most users. Take, for example, how many mid-range users actually have V-mount batteries at their disposal or even own a DMX controller. Those are features that very possibly might never be enjoyed outside of a high-budget production environment, so I think they really nailed it by focusing only on the aspects that bring maximum value to most users and leaving out the less used features to price the light at such an accessible price point. But given its outputs, I think even most pro users would seriously consider adding a couple of these to their kits just because. And that's all I got on the Amaran 200x. If you do enjoy this review, then you might want to check out some of my other ones.